Thank you. I always forget. It looks super smooth. That's great to hear. Yeah, the wired connection is just, it's the safest bet. So I'm happy this is working. It's awesome. Even though this thing is, hard to maneuver, like this PowerPoint, it just opened. I clicked, I think I don't know. Are we all spoiled with technology at this point? You just want it now because things are so advanced. You just click it, it's there. 5G now, it's like, really? How much faster can my phone get? But anyways, all right. So today we've got a pretty incredible and interesting lecture. It's sort of like, I always say I love biology because, for so many reasons, but you can really relate it to so much. And we're going to kind of talk about history at the beginning of this lecture, do a little history lesson on the planet, the Earth, the history of life. And we're going to go pretty quickly through the history of life. We're going to go through 4.6 billion years in about 4.6 minutes. So let's take a look. Okay. So I mentioned that, lecture 20. Oh, I got to change that. I mentioned that we're going to take a look at the history of our Earth and this incredible theory in biology called the Endosymbiotic Theory. And I talk about this now. Some other professors that teach intro like to talk about it. They like to talk about it during the organelles section of our course, but I feel like it's in the textbook, it's presented this way when we start to do protists. That's the focus of today, kingdom Protista. Because the origin or how protists came into existence was based on this theory. So it's very relevant to this kingdom of life. And so you guys remember we, on Wednesday last week, we were talking about, we did phylogenetic trees, right? And we mapped out sort of how we group organisms, how we construct these trees based on shared characteristics and traits that evolved over time in groups of organisms with these traits. And we did a sort of sample tree with, let this person in. We did sample tree with the different domains of life. And I mentioned that this was our most broad view of all life on our planet. There's 3 domains: bacteria, which there are still plenty of today; archaea, again, lots of archaea. They tend to live in extreme environments like hydrothermal vents, hot springs, things like that. Also prokaryotic, we've discussed that a little bit. And then domain eukarya, which consists of the 4 kingdoms, right, of eukaryotes or eukaryotic organisms. These were animals, plants, protists, and fungi. So today we're going to take a look at protists. And that's kind of what the rest of this unit is, except I'm going to do one lecture on ecology because I think it's kind of cool and fun to do that. I have a good amount of students who want to go into that field and study the, behavior of organisms and relationships of animals and plants and the environment and, global warming and how to reduce carbon emissions like that. I have students who want to pursue that kind of thing. So we'll do one lecture on that as well. But really the bulk of this unit, we're going to be exploring these 4 kingdoms and how they came into existence by starting at the early history of Earth, which is what we're going to start with today, and their unique features. So this week we're doing protists and fungi. Next week, plants and animals. And then I think ecology, and that's like it. We're like so close. It's crazy. But like I said, so it's so frustrating. I don't know why all my technology started to be annoying. Maybe it's because I updated. I should not have updated my computer. I kind of like it though, the new layout. I have Big Sur now on my Mac, but it's not worth it if everything doesn't work. But for some reason, my notes aren't syncing to my phone. You know how I use my phone for my notes? So I have to use my other, anyway, I have it up, should work. So without further ado, let's begin the history of life. Take you on a journey through the origins of the planet. Okay? And we can see how clear the whiteboard is. Hoping it'll be good enough. Okay. Okay. So actually, I think I'm going to redraw this timeline that you see here on the whiteboard. There's going to be a couple key events, 1, 2, 3, 4 to be precise. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And as you can see, I should stop sharing. Okay. As you can see from the slide, I have a picture of the Earth, and really I was just reading about it today, just because during the day, I sometimes just look at my textbook and look at like the updated things, and I'm always trying to learn and refine my knowledge and, become more knowledgeable, I guess. And I find it interesting, but the Earth was formed around 4.6 billion years ago. And I'm going to use billion years ago. I'm going to abbreviate it, especially with my shorter whiteboard here, as BYA. So this is billions of years ago, or billion years ago, 4.6 billion years ago, which is kind of a long time. This is the origin of the Earth, meaning this is when our planet formed. I was reading about it. And it was a cloud of dust and gases that condensed. So it got really cold and formed a solid. That's what I was reading. I was like, man, it must be more complicated than that, but man, that's crazy. So that's how the planet formed. And what else? Yeah. Okay, so the important thing to know for this course, that 4.6 billion years ago, this Earth, there was no oxygen, okay? So anaerobic conditions. I think I'll, let me write. Okay, let me do this. No oxygen. O2 is oxygen gas. So it's anaerobic conditions. So obviously we wouldn't thrive, right? No oxygen. What there was there's only carbon dioxide, methane gas, water, methane, and let's add water. No, my eraser's in the way. There's nitrogen gas, those kinds of things, but no oxygen. That'll be important in our story. Okay. There was no oxygen, but there was water. Yes, pretty much. Yeah. I think that the water, this is getting into astrophysics. We should ask Neil deGrasse Tyson. I'm interested. But all I read was that there was all these substances and it got cold, really cold, and it all condensed. But yeah. Anyways, okay. Now so that's when the Earth was formed. Now it took roughly, I'm doing the mental math here, 0.8 billion years for the first life form to appear. So this was 3.8 billion years ago. This was the first prokaryotes. First prokaryotes appeared on Earth. So prokaryotes, bacteria. Really, bacteria and archaea, right? We learned our prokaryotes. These are single-celled organisms, extremely small, simple in structure, not complex. They have no nucleus. They just have a very small genome, very little DNA, and they haven't changed much since then. They're still here. Bacteria are still around, and archaea. Now, there's no oxygen, right? So these guys, here's a tricky question, kind of call back to earlier unit. What kind of, well, first of all, every life form has to have some form of energy metabolism, has to extract energy from food somehow. Every life form. So if it's anaerobic, what process are these bacteria doing 3.8 billion years ago? If there's no oxygen, how are they producing ATP without oxygen? What anaerobic process did we learn back in Unit 2? Bingo. Fermentation. Yes. Fermentation is an ancient primitive form of energy metabolism. It was our quick, dirty, cheap, easy way, right, to generate ATP in the absence of oxygen. And so these are anaerobic bacteria, the first life forms. Anaerobic bacteria. So they're fermenting. They're producing lactic acid or alcohol fermentation. Actually, maybe. I actually don't know about that. Mostly lactic acid, I think. You don't have to know that. Okay. I'm going to add something. I'm going to add they make ATP via fermentation. You can even say make 2 ATP, right, per unit glucose, right? That'll be important when we continue our story here. Just that it's inefficient, right? You don't get much bang for your buck. We've learned that before. Okay, so the next event, like I said, we're going pretty quick here through time. Even though a billion years is a very long time, but it took a while. It took a while for this next thing to happen. And I'm going to do it in green for a very specific reason, but the next event that occurred of significance was the appearance of cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria, which was 2.5, just checking my dates here. I'm always bad with dates. Was that before? No, that's right. Okay, 2.5 billion years ago. We're going to write cyanobacteria. So it's cyanobacteria appeared. I'm going to write them in green for a specific reason, or I'm writing them in green for a specific reason. Let's see on my slide here. There they are. Oh, here are my cyanobacteria. See how they're green? They're green. What process do you think they're going to be doing? I actually mentioned these guys when we talked about photosynthesis in our lecture, that plants, algae, certain protists, and these guys, well, oh wait, I just gave the answer, huh? Photosynthesis. Oh well. So I'm going to write photosynthetic bacteria. So cyanobacteria are bacteria that perform photosynthesis. Okay, so let me ask you a different question then. What's a byproduct of photosynthesis that you think would accumulates in the atmosphere that was lacking before? Oxygen, you bet. So they call it the oxygen explosion. Essentially, once these guys appeared and photosynthesis became a thing, they were harnessing the thermal energy from the sun to synthesize sugars. Oxygen was released. All of a sudden, the Earth got oxygen in its atmosphere. So I'm going to write, let's do cyanobacteria appeared. Let's write O2 accumulates in atmosphere. Okay. Now we're getting somewhere as far as life forming. Okay, so oh, what's going on? I thought I muted everyone. Someone's hacking me. Mute. Okay. So the next event occurred shortly after this. I actually believe I looked into this event, and I don't think people know the exact date or the exact around this time. But it happens somewhere between here and here. And that's all you have to know. It's shortly after this, I believe. Because once oxygen accumulated in the atmosphere, organisms that could use that oxygen started to appear, namely aerobic bacteria. Aerobic bacteria, they're going to be important to our story. So aerobic bacteria and in contrast to the anaerobes that can only ferment glucose and produce lactic acid, we learned the aerobic pathway, right, where oxygen's used. Where is oxygen used specifically in metabolism? Or when? Does anyone remember oxygen's role? Why do I need that? Why is that so good for me? And my cells. Aerobic cellular respiration, absolutely. Specifically, the part of aerobic cellular respiration, the electron transport chain, right? Where oxygen binds at the last membrane protein, draws those electrons down the chain. Thought you'd never hear about that again, didn't you? Look at me, bringing it all back. Okay, so these guys are going to make 36 to 38 ATP via cell respiration. I'll just abbreviate it, cellular respiration. How does the whiteboard look on your screens? It doesn't look great on my screen, but I have, I think it's the computer and, bit blurry towards the top. But is it a lot worse than what it was before? Or is it still, or was it like blurry before too? Kind of same. It's not that much worse. Okay, cool. That's good. But I can always bring this up and sort of. So this says make 36 to 38 ATP via cellular respiration. So these guys are utilizing oxygen and producing energy in a much more efficient manner. Getting a lot more ATP. Okay. So the last event, is there a timeline there? No. So I've actually looked into this, and I don't think scientists know the exact date, but it had to have been, but after this event, right? But after oxygen came into the planet, right? Probably shortly after. Cellular respiration. I just abbreviated it cell res because I ran out of room. So the last event, 1.5 billion years ago, we see the emergence of our first eukaryotes, our first eukaryotic cells. So this is the first eukaryotes. Totally ran out of room, but I'm gonna, maybe I'll erase and you can write underneath. Yeah. So I think what I'll do is I'll erase this and write again. So just on your piece of paper, just write underneath. I'm gonna write some, just as a refresher, I guess, of what defines a eukaryote, because today, as the topic is protists, they are the first eukaryotes, as we'll see. The first eukaryotes are kingdom Protista. Okay. So I'm going to erase now. So the first eukaryotes appeared 1.5 billion years ago, and this is the event that we're going to talk about before we get into protists, how that happened. But first, let's define a eukaryote again. Eukaryote. So this applies to all of domain eukarya. Anything within this domain is composed of cells of these characteristics. So they have a nucleus. Containing the genetic information, DNA. And they also have many complex membrane-bound organelles, as we know. And the four groups of eukaryotes, what are they? Just as a recall from last lecture. Just rattle them off for me. Fungi, totally. Fungi are all eukaryotes. Not bacteria. Bacteria are prokaryotes. Unicellular prokaryotes. What else we got? Animals, you bet. Kingdom Animalia, or animals. Plants, Kingdom Plantae. And last one, subject of our lecture today, protists, yes. Which are the ancient eukaryotes. Just remembered, I forgot to play music at the beginning of the lecture. I was all caught up with my other technical difficulties. Oh well, next time. Okay. Out. Okay, so that's the history lesson. So now let's talk about the origin of the eukaryotic cell. The origin of the eukaryotic cell, how did the first eukaryote form? How did a cell with a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles form? This is called the endosymbiotic theory. It's pretty amazing. Let's take a look. Oh, those are my associated pictures. Okay. Endosymbiotic theory. You can totally talk about this at your Thanksgiving dinner. You'll impress all your family. They'll be like, no way, that's what happened to my cells, bro. It'll be tight. Okay. Oops. Okay. Endosymbiotic theory, or endosymbiosis, same thing. So endo, inside. Symbiosis comes from the Greek root to live together, coexist. Politics. Yeah. Thought that said police. I was like, yeah, that makes sense. Because my old computer is kind of blurry, so I can't read as well. But okay, so endo, this is gonna be like live inside, and symbiosis or symbiotic is to live together. Yeah, that's right. Live together inside. Okay. So what is this referring to? Endosymbiotic theory is a theory that describes the origin of the eukaryotic cell, as I said. specifically the prokaryotic origin of two organelles. Okay. What do I mean by that? I'm telling you that on our timeline, we had anaerobic bacteria, we had aerobic bacteria, we also had cyanobacteria. They're all doing different cellular processes in energy metabolism, photosynthesis, and these are all bacterial. These are all prokaryotic. And the endosymbiotic theory, what it's saying, and what we're going to write down and take a look at, is that both, first, the two organelles that are being referred to here are the mitochondria and the chloroplasts. That both the mitochondria and chloroplasts inside all of your cells, not chloroplasts, because that's plants, photosynthesis, but the mitochondria were once free-living bacteria, aerobic bacteria, that performed aerobic cellular respiration in our story. And they were internalized by another bacterium. It actually engulfed it, ate it, took it inside of its own cell, and harnessed its ability to extract oxygen and produce all this energy. Really what happened was an anaerobic bacterium that made barely any energy with fermentation saw the aerobic bacteria and was like, dude, you make way more energy. I'm gonna eat you, or let's work together. And whether that bacteria liked it or not, the anaerobic engulfed it. And it became an organelle within that brand new cell that, so it was like, yeah, kind of exploiting it for its really efficient energy production. And then, so that's the mitochondrial aspect. And then a secondary endosymbiosis happened with the chloroplast. And a cell engulfed a cyanobacterium that performed photosynthesis because it wanted to create sugars from sunlight. And believe it or not, those organisms were the first protists. The ones that engulfed the mitochondria were a certain group of protists. The ones that engulfed the chloroplast became a certain group of protists. And these groups later became, through mutations and millions of years, became the plants, the fungi, and the animals that we know today. The protists preceded all of them, gave rise to all of them. They are our ancient ancestors. And there are protists today, still. And that's what we're going to talk about today. But first, I want to put this all in writing and maybe do a drawing. I like to spend time on endosymbiosis because it's a really fascinating event. So let's write some more first about endosymbiosis, kind of specifically what I said. What I said occurred. The mitochondria and the chloroplasts which we learned as cell organelles in eukaryotes. Were once free-living bacteria. That became engulfed or eaten and are now permanent organelles in the eukaryotic cell. And again, the mitochondria was a bacterium that was aerobic, right, performing respiration, which is why that's what they do. They have an electron transport chain, Krebs cycle, remember all these things. So this was an aerobic bacterium. And then the chloroplasts, right, that are responsible for photosynthesis in plants and algae and things. These organelles were the cyanobacteria. So all of your living cells contain mitochondria, which are not living bacteria now, but they are certainly, they were at one point autonomous on their own. And now we kind of duplicate them and exploit their machinery to produce energy. It's pretty amazing. Now, how do we know this? That's another important thing I want to teach you guys. How do we know this happened and that these were once bacteria, like organisms within our cells, right? What does it say in green? Oh, cyanobacteria. Yeah, cyanobacteria. Those are the chloroplasts. So there are a few pieces of evidence that I want you to know that really support this theory. Yes, James, that's right. That's one. You will actually find mitochondrial DNA. Bacterial DNA, it has the exact same sequences of aerobic bacteria, DNA within the mitochondria. Yeah, so the DNA in your nucleus, the chromosomes we've looked at, it's not all you have. In fact, you inherit all your mitochondrial DNA from the mother. Interesting enough. But that's one piece of evidence. There's several others. So let's go ahead and write that. So evidence of the endosymbiotic theory. Is anyone else amazed by this? I think it's crazy that we learned all this through science and reason. It's like, wow, we're getting an understanding of life, you know? I'm a nerd. Okay. What's next? Okay, so the evidence that supports this theory. It's about 4 pieces of evidence. Okay. Actually, during the cell cycle, when you duplicate organelles, these organelles duplicate like bacteria do by binary fission. It's just a fancy word for how bacteria divide. It's basically mitosis, but with a little nuance to it, or a couple nuances. So, let's write. It's not all the organelles, right? It's just the bacteria or mitochondria and chloroplasts. So mitochondria and chloroplasts duplicate like bacteria. Now, so the DNA, right, that I believe James mentioned, DNA, right? So they contain, and not just DNA, circular DNA. So when you take microbiology, you'll learn that bacteria, if you take bacteria, their genome is one chromosome and it's in a circle. The DNA is connected in a circle like this. It's kind of weird. And the mitochondrial DNA is circular. DNA in our nucleus is linear. Those chromosomes in our, it's linear strung out DNA, right? It's not, doesn't form a circle. The third piece of evidence. Where are you? Oh, there's bacterial ribosomes. Oftentimes, if anyone goes into evolutionary biology and you look for relationships between species, evolutionary biologists will look at the ribosomes because I don't know why exactly, but similarity in ribosome structure is really, it correlates with how related a species is. So they also have ribosomes. That's like a huge indicator of, whoa. And it looks like a bacterial ribosome. Like it's producing proteins, right? Everything has ribosomes. Crazy. Okay, and then, something else we learned. You guys know this. Mitochondria and chloroplasts have a double membrane. They have two membranes. Now, why would that indicate why would that be indicative of these bacteria that were engulfed, taken up by another prokaryote? I'll show you. Just a second. Okay. So check this out. Depending on time, I don't know if I'll do the drawing, but I don't want to get out of this, man. Oh, there we go. Okay. So here's a sort of drawing of what's going on here. So this ancestral prokaryote makes a nucleus, fine, okay, it has a nucleus, that happens. But here's the endosymbiosis. So the aerobic bacterium is engulfed, it's taken up. And now it becomes a part of this eukaryote, the first eukaryote, right? And of course, the cyanobacterium is also taken up. There's an important, glad I remembered, important distinction, a last kind of thing I want to be sure I mention before we talk about protists tonight. Move this for a minute. And it's the reason why all eukaryotes have mitochondria, meaning plants and algae that photosynthesize have mitochondria. We learned this. Now, why don't eukaryotes just have cyanobacteria? The reason is, and why do they all have mitochondria? And then why do some, like us, don't have chloroplasts? Okay, so let me kind of put it on me again. What happened was ancestral prokaryote took up mitochondria, right? It actually gave rise and became us, animals, animal-like protists, and fungi, things that don't photosynthesize. And then one of those cells, you know, it diverged off, became animals and all that. But one of those cells took up another bacterium. We call it secondary endosymbiosis. And it was a chloroplast. And it became the algae and the plants that we see. So there was never an event where it just took up the chloroplast. It was already a cell with mitochondria in it. It was just so useful as an energy. And, you know, it was early that, I don't know, you know, nobody knows the details, but that's how it happened. A cell that had already engulfed a mitochondrion took on a chloroplast, and that's why they all have mitochondria too. And I'm gonna draw that out for you guys. There's a cool little diagram I like to do. And it leads us perfectly into protists next. So let's do it. First, are there any questions as I erase here? So I'm going to do a sort of representative phylogenetic tree, just really quick to show you what I'm talking about right now. Frick. Forgot to mention the double membrane thing, right? Why that's evidence. I knew I was forgetting something. But you see in this picture, when this membraned cell, as we know, cells all have the plasma cell membrane, when it takes on that bacterium and internalizes it into the cell, it surrounds it in part of its membrane. Part of the membrane actually pinches off and encloses around it. And that bacterium already has a membrane. That's why the double membrane thing supports this theory of endosymbiosis, because it was engulfed. And chloroplasts also have 2 membranes. Craziness. Okay, before we get to the kingdom Protista, let's do that phylogenetic tree I wanted to draw. So it's going to represent domain Eukarya. And let's start with the ancestral prokaryote that is going to engulf the other bacteria, right? So let's start there. And this is all, actually, I'll just leave it at that for now. Ancestral prokaryote. So it's going to engulf the aerobic bacterium. This is primary endosymbiosis. And it's the origin of the mitochondria. Now, as I said, draw this out a little further, these cells are going to branch off. They're going to diverge out. They have mitochondria in them. And they're going to eventually become 2 groups, which we're going to talk about today. The animal-like protists and the fungi-like protists. When we talk about protists, we're going to be talking about 3 groups of protists: animal-like, fungal-like, or fungi-like and plant-like. So after this mitochondria is inside cells, they go on, they become animal-like protists, fungi-like protists. And then, in a separate event, now remember, this applies all the way out, right? In a separate event, draw branching up there, there's going to be secondary endosymbiosis. And this is the origin of the chloroplast. This is when the cyanobacterium was taken up. And this group is going to be, or it's going to lead to the plant-like protists. But I wanted to draw that out so you see why all eukaryotes have mitochondria. But not all eukaryotes have chloroplasts. That's why we don't photosynthesize. World hunger wouldn't be an issue. Just make your own food from the sun. Wouldn't that be cool? But we'd probably be a plant and not be able to do anything fun. Just stand there. I don't know. If I come back as another organism, I would be down to be a plant, I think. Just kind of sunbathe, chill. I don't know. Maybe. Okay. Are we all on board? Are we all good? Any questions before we? So this is a perfect place to jump into protists. We're at the protists. Okay. So as I mentioned, see how there are fungal-like protists, animal-like, and plant-like. These are all our ancient ancestors when it comes to domain eukarya. The protists are the very first eukaryotes that eventually evolved to become fungi and to become animals and to become plants. The protists are very interesting. Yeah, is it hard to see? I think it's the computer. Or is that better? That's better? Okay, cool. Yeah, it was kind of far away, so gives me room to write, but I should just like get in the habit of moving it closer. Okay. All right. So let's start with the animal-like protists and what they're about. Okay. So there are three categories of protists, as we saw, We're going to start with animal. Here's the slide. So those are a few animal-like protists. And interestingly enough, they still exist today, and really interesting. Because, I mean, let's be honest, kingdom protists, you probably haven't heard that word unless you're a biologist. But you probably haven't, you've heard of plants and animals and fungi, but protists are kind of like this misfit group of organisms. And they're a group that essentially they're misfits because now we're going to learn animals and plants and fungi, they're very specific. And it applies to all of them. They have very specific criteria. Lights in my eye. Very specific criteria that defines them as plant, animal, or fungi. But the protists are animal-like, they're plant-like. So they share some characteristics, but they have enough differences where you're like, I can't really call you a plant, I can't call you an animal. You don't have this or that. We're going to look at the animal-like protists first. And like I said, you may not have heard of protists, but you maybe have heard of a couple animal-like protists that exist today. Amoebas, for instance, are animal-like protists. Amoeba. Another one's called a paramecium. And we get to look at these in the lab, so it's kind of sad that we don't get to. But they're cool looking under the microscope. Amoebas, paramecium, trypanosomes. So these guys are parasites. And these are red blood cells. And they cause a disease called African sleeping sickness. There's also another famous animal-like protist parasite, and it causes malaria. It's Plasmodium Falciparum. It's an animal-like protist parasite that infiltrates red blood cells and causes malaria, but it's a protist. So it's not good. But those are a few examples. Let's take a look at what defines an animal-like protist. What are these guys about? So another word for the animal-like protists are protozoa. There are protozoans, protozoa, meaning before animals, like zoo animals, before. So again, these are the ancestors. These existed before animals and later gave rise to them, became them. Although they still exist, but over time, mutations and forming new groups, you get animals. So the protozoa, they're all heterotrophs. New word. Which means, so something that's heterotrophic, an organism, needs to obtain energy really by consuming other organisms. So obtain energy by eating others. So we're heterotrophs. The next thing, yes, we are heterotrophs. We have to eat plants, animals, anything. Can't photosynthesize. Got to get our energy from sugars and fats from other things. But the next criterion here is that they are unicellular, single celled. It's kind of a defining feature that makes them different from animals. Animals are multicellular. So they live in water. Or inside animals as parasites, right? There's a couple other nasty protozoans that cause diseases. Trying to remember that. Giardia is caused by a protozoan parasite. So a lot of third world countries that don't filter their water supply can get Giardia infections, really bad. What else? There's blinking. It's actually a scary brain-eating amoeba that lives in certain hot springs. Extremely rare, but yeah, so diseases caused by these guys are less common, except malaria, of course. But anyways, side note. Okay, what's next? Oh, most are capable of movement. So they move by one of three mechanisms. So move by so I'm going to write them down. Pseudopodia, cilia. I can move this closer and spell it out. Cilia or flagella. I'm going to show you what this all means. So first, pseudopodia is a sort of oozing movement. This is what amoebas do. So you'll see how this amoeba, see how it oozes out, it extends its cytoplasm out, and it kind of extends it and retracts it. So it moves by this oozing. Pseudopodia is what it's called, basically meaning fake feet, pseudopods. See how they're like reached out like fake feet, but it's not really feet, it's part of their cell structure. So that's called pseudopodia movement. The paramecium, can't see it in this picture because they're pretty small, but the paramecium are surrounded by hair-like structures called cilia. And the hair-like structures beat back and forth, and it allows them to move around, the paramecium cell. And then lastly, the Trypanosoma here. See how it has a tail? That's called a flagellum. Single flagellum, flagella for multiple. Sperm cells also have a flagella. It's a tail used for movement. So they have unique methods of movement depending on what protozoan we're talking about. So these are the characteristics of protozoans. Questions about our protozoans here before we move on to plant-like protists. Bust out my green for that. Okay, plant-like protists. I'm sure you've heard of these guys. Probably didn't know some of them are protists. I actually didn't know myself when I first started teaching biology. Okay. What time is it? Oh, we're doing great. Okay. So here's some examples of plant-like protists. Diatoms, dinoflagellates, euglena, it's a single-celled algae, and this guy, seaweed. This is a multicellular algae. So I named a few examples of plant-like protists. First, let's define their characteristics. They live in water, salt water or fresh water. Salt water and fresh water. They're not heterotrophs. They're actually what we call photoautotrophs. So all are photoautotrophs, which means use sunlight to obtain energy, as we know via photosynthesis, right? So these are all photosynthetic. So we can write that too, why not? All are photosynthetic. Actually, now that I think about it, I just kind of learned this because this isn't really my background, organismal bio and stuff. So it was kind of cool when I started teaching intro. I got to learn some of this stuff that I wasn't aware of. And some are like called mixotrophs, which can do photosynthesis, but they also eat others or engulf them and digest them. It's kind of crazy. I didn't know that they could do both. Some of them. Most I don't think can do both though. Most are just doing photosynthesis and creating sugars for energy. So let's take a look at a few examples of these plant-like protists. Okay, so diatoms, dinoflagellates, there's so many examples, but these are actually phytoplankton. So plankton, like in SpongeBob, plankton, he's a plant-like protist. He's a protist. And algae in general. So algae can be single-celled. There's multicellular algae with green algae, red algae. So that being said, there's both single-celled and multicellular plant-like protists. Seaweed. I thought it was a plant, but it's actually not. It's a protist. It lacks some certain characteristics that plants have. So it makes it a protist. This is the bioluminescence. So did anyone, when that was happening, did anyone see that? I saw it for the first time. It was, what was that, like beginning of this year, maybe? Maybe around March or something. Or shortly after. That was awesome. And those are plankton, protists. Okay, let me see what else I got for you guys. Oh. Okay. So we got 5 minutes. So let's go to our next, or our last group of protists, the fungus-like protists. Okay. Fungal-like protists. So like fungi, which we're going to talk about next time, they act as heterotrophic decomposers, meaning they break down organic plant and animal matter that's dead and obtain energy from it. So they live on, or they live in water or on dead, decaying organic material like bogs and things like that. On dead, decaying organic material. They are multicellular, these guys. So there's no single-celled ones. And a common misconception, because, well, I'll hammer this point, I think, next time even more, but fungus, fungal-like protists, and fungi in general are not photosynthetic. So we'll look next time that mushrooms are fungi, and they come from the ground, but they don't do photosynthesis. They actually break down material around them to obtain energy and digest it outside of their bodies and then absorb the digested nutrients. But they, they come out of the ground, they look like plants, right? But they don't do photosynthesis. They're not green. So they're heterotrophs like us, actually. Why was I saying that again? Oh, just so we can say they're not, what are we on time? Okay, perfect. Not photosynthetic, as a reminder. And let's just take there's a few examples of these guys, only a few. And I have them pictured here. So these ancient fungi, protists, fungus-like protists, right? They don't have they have some weird variations. You don't have to know, but they're, this is a water mold. So I'll even write that as an example of one of these is a water mold. And then the one below it is a slime mold. And they kind of look crazy with fancy colors sometimes. So water molds and slime molds would be our two examples of fungus-like protists. Bubblegum. Ew, yeah. It kind of does. Yeah, can you believe those exist? They look crazy. Fungus, they're weird. They produce crazy chemicals and compounds and stuff. My roommate drinks this thing called lion's mane, and she says it gives her energy. It's like, it doesn't. Caffeine, is that, you know, caffeine does that. Why do you need this lion's mane? But it comes from mushrooms. Who knows? They produce kind of. I was like all being scientific biologist, and I was like, what's the evolutionary significance of this thing? Probably that maybe like it's toxic to certain animals. Who knows? Is it like Booch? I have no idea. Booch. Oh, kombucha. No, I don't think so. Kombucha, from my understanding, is kind of like yogurt in liquid form. It's like fermented some tea or something, and it's but it's lactic acid fermented by bacteria, but the nutrients source isn't lactose, it's something else, but it's just kind of, yeah, fermented with, and there's lactic acid. At least that's what I think. Okay. That's it. That's all for tonight. So yes, we're meeting Wednesday. I'm glad the computer worked. Is there any other questions before we depart? Tonight's lab, it's another video. I think Steve cut out some parts because it's a shorter week, plus to give you guys kind of a break. So I'll send that along. What else? That's it. No questions? Ready for the holiday? I am. I love Thanksgiving, man. Oh, it's the best holiday. Food, man, it's so good. Okay, well, as always, just email me if anything comes up. And see you guys Wednesday. All right, cool. Thank you guys.